welcome. You have spent your career bridging nuclear policy, diplomacy, and humanitarian work, from advising the CTB tier in Vienna to now leading Harvard's project on managing the atom. Today, we'll explore how nuclear governance is evolving amid new technologies, new players, and new geopolitical realities.
Thank you so much, Ali, for inviting me. I very much look forward to this conversation.
Jumping right in, our first subject, the changing nuclear order. How has the global non-proliferation regime adapted or failed to adapt to the rise of multipolar nuclear politics involving China, India, and other regional powers?
This is a really important question. And let me say, we are having this conversation, you and I, together in a very specific moment in time where, if we think about the global nuclear order as a set of relations, it's changing across all of them. The nuclear non-proliferation regime in particular was based on a grand bargain. Nuclear weapon states would have committed to work in good faith towards general disarmament, and nuclear non-proliferation and non-nuclear weapon states would have then committed not to proliferate. What we see today is the two elements of this grand bargain are fraying at the edges. Now, the regime is not collapsing yet, but certainly is encountering major challenges. As you have pointed out, we are now witnessing the rise of a nuclear multipolar world. For the first time, probably in an unprecedented turn, China is definitely building very fast its nuclear arsenal. It used to be very small and relatively constrained. India and Pakistan are also changing very much their dynamic. Nuclear weapons have become very central to the South Asia deterrence relation. We have seen unprecedented nuclear threats coming out of Russia on its ongoing war with Ukraine. So the relation among nuclear weapon states is dramatically changing. But we are also seeing major changes among non-nuclear weapon states who are now pointing out that the nuclear weapon states are in fact not fulfilling the part of the bargain. There is no sight, in the foreseeable future towards nuclear reduction. And some non-nuclear weapon states are arguing that if the grand bargain was based on the fulfilling of a general disarmament promise, then perhaps they should not abide by the nuclear non-proliferation commitment themselves. You heard, for example, of Iran discussing the possibility of withdrawing from the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. There have been discussions in Poland, in Ukraine, in South Korea, of these countries arguing that they need to develop indigenous nuclear capabilities. So let's just say the nuclear order today is shaking. The ground is shaking. The foundations are weak. We don't expect the crumbling of the institutions yet, but certainly we are in a moment where something needs to happen in order to restore the very foundations of the nuclear order.
It is quite sobering to see the direction that the world is going in. There's the most important ingredient in diplomacy, Doctor, is trust. And what we are seeing is the trust is eroding. And in such precarious situation, often it takes a lot worse to happen before people are forced to build trust or rebuild trust. Do you have any optimism that the world will avoid going to a far worse place, change direction for the positive before that?
So I think these are really important questions, especially when it comes to trust. Let me address how, in your previous question, you asked whether the regime has been able to adapt itself. I mean, we have some successful stories that need to be celebrated. The nuclear non-proliferation regime, in spite of the crisis and certainly of pressures, has been able to achieve a remarkable result. The problem is how fast is it able to adapt and how quickly, right, it can actually be supported. So we have a tendency, in a way, not to be able to get in front of potential crises and not to create mechanisms that are, in fact, able probably to prevent those crises before they erupt. The question of trust is also a very important one. And I have to tell you that today, the political environment is as such where the idea of diplomatic accommodation or negotiation is not considered necessarily an achievement, but it is considered an appeasement. And this used to be very different in the past, where if you look at the US and the Soviet Union, despite, their tensions and their, ideological conflict, had been able to negotiate the creation of the NPT. So trust today is certainly as a short supply, and it requires much more work in order to build the conditions for domestic audiences to accept diplomatic efforts internationally. What is missing today is the domestic constituency that support possible accommodations internationally.
That is very helpful. Thank you, Doctor. Really appreciate it. Now, moving towards science diplomacy, how can scientific collaboration rebuild trust where political dialogue has broken down, especially between rivals like the US and China?
This is extremely important because if you look, for example, at the historical precedents, especially between the United States and the Soviet Union, the very first attempts to a conversation, even on nuclear restraint, nuclear verification, came out of scientist-to-scientist collaboration. In particularly, was in 1957 that a conference on science and world affairs called Pugwash was actually created in Canada with the purpose of bringing American scientists and Soviet scientists in a apolitical discussion over nuclear weapons. And the entire idea was that scientists encountered the same challenges in terms of nuclear safety, in terms of safeguards, in terms of risk reduction. And if they are somehow able to compartmentalize their scientific work from the political discussions, they can actually reach common areas for cooperation. And that actually was extremely successful in the 60s, where in fact Pugwash was the one that opened the very first discussions between the Soviet and the Americans on arms control. In fact, the Pugwash conference was so successful that these dialogues ultimately resulted in the Partial Test Ban Treaty in 1963, signed actually by the United States and the Soviet Union to reduce the potential for nuclear testing around the world. So the idea of building some diplomatic channels through scientific collaboration is extremely important. Let me say that for a while, we have had pretty successful collaboration also on other issues. Nuclear safety, climate modeling, for example, have all helped creating a more global scientific community of Chinese, American, Russians, Europeans, and so on and so forth. And this certainly has helped. The issue, in my view, that we've encountered today is particularly due to COVID. I think with COVID, the idea of scientific collaboration has been deeply undermined. The idea today is the scientific collaboration is looked through the lenses of national security. Scientists are no longer trusted to actually interact with one another, or we somehow try to legitimize the scientific knowledge altogether. So I believe that we need to restart those conversations, and we need to do it in a way that demonstrates to the political class that these actually conversations at the scientific level are extraordinarily important for national security.
Now, I wonder, do scientists need a green light from political class to have even basic conversations or exchange of non-confidential scientific exploration? You being a scientist yourself, but also in diplomacy space, do they need?
The issue is twofold. It depends very much on the scope of these dialogues. So the Cold War models were for scientists to engage in very deep discussions on technical issues and then to go and brief the political class. And based on the conversations and the sort of the dialogue, then the political class was then taking actions in order, for example, to negotiate arms control agreements or, again, potential policy harmonization between the two camps. Today, you might not need necessarily to have the approval or the support of the political class, but by actually operating without that backing in a way, that dialogue becomes much more limited. Let me give you an example of my trips to China. I go often to China. I interact with the Chinese nuclear expert community. But on both sides, there is a sense that the domestic audience, the domestic political audience, is just not involved in these dialogues. And therefore, what we somehow discuss in these track 2 dialogues remain, it's an important topic, but doesn't necessarily have a follow-up in the policy arena. And so I believe it is important for the scientific community to make an argument, to set a rationale within the domestic political class that these conversations are important, that re-engaging at the scientific level with nuclear weapon states is extraordinarily important. And for that, we need at least the political opening to allow these conversations maybe to translate into policies. If not, it remains a little bit of an aesthetic exercise where, we go and meet with the Chinese, but at the end, nothing actually moves on the policy front. What Pugwash did was instead being well aware that the political class could then follow up with some policy proposals on the table in various international organizations. I think this is what's missing today. We need to have a domestic discussion about why re-engaging at certain levels is important for nuclear restraint.
That makes so much sense. If scientists are having a lot of interaction, but that does not translate to policymaking, then there's not much benefit of that, right? Because the whole point is building the trust between political class through scientific connections. You're right about that. Also, just to add to the historical precedent of scientific collaboration leading to building, one great example is the International Space Station.
Absolutely.
Right? The collaboration between Soviet Union and United States. That was the biggest project during that whole Cold War time, which forced the political class to build trust so that their scientists can work together on doing this phenomenal project.
Absolutely. And another great project, let me mention, which is still alive today, but again, needs, in my view, to have greater political leverage, is the international monitoring system of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization. When the CTBTO was created in 1996, the world came together to establish what it is perhaps today the largest international monitoring framework in the world. CTBTO has roughly 300 monitoring stations around the world. They operate 24/7 to capture, seismic activities, nuclide isotopes, like acoustic sounds that might actually then allow the system to recognize whether nuclear test explosion has taken place anywhere in the world. That international monitoring system is perhaps one of the most magnificent scientific achievements of the international community. In Vienna, we have a large number of scientists from all over the world across multiple scientific disciplines that work together day in and day out to review all the data points that these stations transmit. Now, this, in my view, opens up a really important possibility for all the countries that support the IMS to actually really create more of a policy framework to collaborate on nuclear restraint. And so being able to use these mechanisms, right, and the scientific community at large, to then create a momentum on the political front. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the safeguards agreements are also another great example of how the scientific communities come together. So this mechanism should be, in my view, strengthened, and we should actually work and use them in order to create more political trust. So the ability, for example, of the United States and the Russian Federation to sit together in one of the international monitoring system meeting and discuss data points is definitely a channel through which more trust can be built. And I think more of these examples are important, especially in a world of, rising tensions among great powers.
And how when you say we need to have domestic discourse on these subjects to encourage political class to work on this subject, what exactly does it look like? If we have policymakers listening to this podcast, but we also have students of grad school at Georgetown, at Harvard, listening to this who do want to contribute to this. What role can they play to initiate these conversations and encourage political class to take this matter seriously?
This is a really important question. Let me mention a couple of very practical points that, in my view, need to happen. There is now a tendency, I think, across domestic political spectrum, it's not only here in the United States, but it's also around the world, to believe the international organizations are useless, are a waste of funding, that they are fundamentally, redundant. Now, I would agree that maybe the UN system needs to be rethought. But organizations like the CTBTO, the International Atomic Energy Agency, were created with that technical expertise in mind. The international monitoring system of the CTBTO is today and should today be used not only to detect nuclear test explosion, but it actually can detect, if geared and tailored properly, could actually help, for example, predict natural disasters in some parts of the world where there is greater vulnerability, for example, could actually be used in order to detect what are the movements of whales, for example, across oceans, which is a very important indicator of whether the temperature in the oceans is rising, could actually use, for example, for, again, disaster preparedness in countries that don't necessarily have a national means. So we need to make those arguments to the political class. So these organizations, and I'm talking about the technical organizations, have such a scientific expertise that can actually really be helpful to strengthen the national verification systems. The United States, and especially Italy, but also other, very wealthy countries, argue that, well, maybe we don't need multilateral organizations because we have national technical means. We already know how to do stuff, right? But there is a fundamental difference between what the United States can do at the national level and what an international organization can do at the international level. Let me give you an example. If the United States were to be concerned, as it is, that the Chinese might decide to resume nuclear testing tomorrow, the United States might actually capture, for example, with its national technical means, some indicators that might actually suggest the Chinese have conducted a nuclear test. But the U.S. national technical means have very little credibility outside of the United States. Countries like Pakistan or Iran or Saudi Arabia might say, well, okay, the United States has captured these specific indicators, but we don't necessarily believe just in the national technical means. So you need a verification at the international level. You need trust at the international level that the national technical mean cannot give you. So it is in the interest of the United States to have this international technical system be strengthened, because the U.S. will not be able to make certain arguments just based on the national data that the U.S. collects. There is a lot of politicization, of technical data across countries, and therefore you need an international validation that a system like the IMS can give you. So we need to set again the rationale for why some international technical instruments are necessary to complement and strengthen what is already a very solid national technical means for some countries like the United States. And I think young scientists and young diplomats that make those points, that connect the international to the national security argument, make us set a really important rationale. We don't invest in these organizations because we are generous. We invest in these organizations because fundamentally they strengthen national security. We need to return to the argument, in my view, and make it much more convincing within the domestic audience.
This is incredible. So you're saying that international technical systems help play a stabilizing role. They do trust building as well. Now, again, I don't want to be pessimistic, but a lot of not technical or not CTB tier, but in other larger organizations, we have seen a lot of intervention by big donor nations, and we see politicization. And then even though they're these international organizations, they are not by one country, just because of larger donation from one country than the others, we see this sort of tension of or erosion of their credibility, even sometimes despite lack of evidence of that. How to counter that?
So I think especially your generation and the new generation of thinkers around global governance needs to push a little bit the boundaries of what global governance actually mean. I worked for the United Nations for a long time. I believed when I was growing up, the UN was what I wanted to serve. For me, it represented a great global value, right, as the global community. But I think things have changed. And so I do appreciate when donors push the boundaries and say, well, maybe we can rethink global governance. Maybe we can have a different form of global governance, that it is less bureaucratic, less burdensome, right, and more agile in responding to the very specific type of challenges that humanity is facing, including climate change, energy security, food security, pandemics, and so on and so forth. And I think it is important to to have a debate today about whether the United Nations, as the organization that oversees all this, the response to these challenges, is designed for the 21st century. I've always believed, Ali, that eventually we will move towards different forms of global governance. And I think new thinkers and a new generation of diplomats might actually be involved in designing these new forms of governance. Let me give you two ideas that to me might actually complement the UN and maybe strengthen the global approach. The first one is I think regional organizations are on the rise. They've been on the rise for a long time, in particular with the European Union, the Southeast Asia, the ASEAN regional organization. These institutions have been weak for a few decades, now then have strengthened over time. Now they might face some additional pressures because of great power politics. But at the end of the day, I think the regional response is going to be an important one for global governance, because the regions ultimately know better what to prioritize. So Southeast Asia does not have the same priorities as the Europeans, and the Gulf countries don't have the same priorities as the South American countries. So regional governance, to me, is going to be a form of governance that will pick up in the future. And the region, in my view, is way more flexible in recruiting scientists from the region and in encouraging regional cooperation that the United Nations have been able to do in many years. But then there is another governance, in my view, that will also emerge. And this, in my view, is going to be more of a transnational network governance. By network, I mean, and this is in particular where individual philanthropists will play a role, you see, for example, the involvement of Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation in the global health system, right? Where you're actually seeing countries across regions developing series of coalitions to fight very specific type of challenges. So I think the United Nations remain as the most important political body, right, as a great representative of the international community. But in my view, we need also to move towards functional governance, which is new forms of cooperation across the globe that target very specific type of problems. I don't believe that the World Health Organization might be the only governance form that is necessary to fight pandemics. I think we need to think much more creatively about governance. For people who actually want to work on international diplomacy, let me say this. I think it's really important that we embrace this challenge today, and the lack of trust in international organizations, the lack of trust in multilateralism. I think we need to welcome that debate. We shouldn't be scared of this. And I think we need to use it really to advance the cause, which is a more integrated global community, more intentional about targeting specific challenges. So I would not somehow get lost in the noise of distrust in international organizations. I would actually use it to have a very, very intentional discussion about what is the future of global governance and how should it look like.
I really appreciate that. We should identify these blockers and then use that as conversations initiators, than to use that as a factor to not continue. Really appreciate that. That's very optimistic of you. Now, let's dive into specific technology to make things a bit more interesting and entertaining for scientists listening to our podcast, right? So do small modular reactors truly democratize access to clean energy, or do they risk creating new proliferation and governance challenges?
So you are raising the question that the nuclear community is today debating on the civilian side, right? So there is a sense that with these new small modular reactors, the nanotechnology, the micro reactors, there are many forms of this, like, smaller reactors, that the nuclear industry might actually be revamped. There will be a nuclear renaissance around the world where nuclear energy will finally arrive to contribute significantly to the combination of energies that are needed for a decarbonized economy. I think the debate today is vibrant. I just came back from a meeting at the University of Michigan talking about all these new technologies. I think small modular reactors present both challenges and cost and risk. Well, the promise is certainly that we will actually be able to build these reactors much quicker than normal power plants. Think about a nuclear power plant might take up to 20 years. The siting is enormous. The liability costs are enormous. The capital costs are very, very big. The insurance costs are huge. So there is a lot that this large nuclear power plant somehow, demand. And so the idea is that small modular reactors, because of their size, could actually be built off-site, which basically means in factory, and therefore they can then be transported to the ultimate site where they have to operate. And the overall idea of the economy of scale of small modular reactors is that by building them in factories, you'll be able to take advantage of modularity. if you're able to reduce the transport cost, if you're able to reduce the liability cost, siting costs, then those technologies will actually be way more competitive than the nuclear energy is today in comparison to, for example, renewable. This is a theory, but it is unproven. And I think this is really important where the scientists today really need to think about this. Right? So the small modular reactors become almost like a PR stunt. We have small modular reactors, but in reality, the theory is not being tested yet because we haven't been built one. And in order for nuclear energy in that form, through small modular reactors, to really be able to play a fundamental, significant role in a decarbonized economy, we will have to build a lot of them. My concern with the small modular reactors is twofold. The first is that we are somehow selling this idea of small modular reactors for the wrong things. If you look at China, the idea of small modular reactors is associated to powering data centers. So China is thinking about small modular reactors for a very specific type of application. That makes a lot of sense. But if we are going around the world and talking to African countries about powering their national industries, the mining industries, the reprocessing industries, the extractive industry with small modular reactors, we are basically selling them a fairy tale. Right? Those industries are so energy intensive that you'd be much better off getting a nuclear power plant and basically having to build 25 small modular reactors. So we have to be very clear about what is the case we are making for small modular reactors. There is another issue, which is an important one. All small modular reactors, at least the ones we have seen in terms of design, require a sort of advanced fuel, HALEU. So far, the United States does not produce, and that would make these advanced reactors even more dependent on Russia, which actually is so far the only producer in the world that actually is able somehow to meet the demand of such a fuel. So we can only scale the nuclear small modular reactor business model if we also scale up the HALEU, the fuel, the advanced fuel that is required for these modular reactors. We can't just do one without doing the other. Otherwise, the supply chain does not work. So there is much more to the promise of small modular reactors that need to be looked at. What I think is interesting, however, and I go back to your question about scientists, is that the idea of the small modular reactor has brought back a lot of enthusiasm for nuclear that didn't exist before. So you can actually see young people really taking an interest in nuclear technology today because they see the promise of something that can be built quicker, faster, at scale. It can also be somehow exported to many other countries around the world. So I think there is an important momentum here that the nuclear industry does not have to miss. Do we have concern about small modular reactors? Of course we have. We have to reinvent entirely the idea in which we safeguard this small modular reactors. They would look differently. They would be positioned differently from nuclear power plants. So the International Atomic Energy Agency will have to look at the proliferation risk of these small modular reactors. They might have very different designs. So we will actually have to scale up all the policies around nuclear no proliferation, the export control policy. So there is a lot to work on. But again, I think the small modular reactors gave you an idea of how to think differently about technology that looks stagnant for many, many years, right? If you are a young person today and you have a choice to go and work for space technology, AI, quantum computing, or nuclear, you probably choose the former. I think small modular reactors is saying, look, nuclear technology can be actually quite cool, but we need to test the business model and we just have to be successful in that model in order to create a real momentum for young professionals to get into this field.
This is incredible. Not all that glitters is gold. Dr. Giovannini, thank you. Thank you for your insights on how policy, science, and ethics intertwine in the nuclear age.
This was 37th in the World, the official podcast of the Georgetown Journal of International Affairs. Please be sure to subscribe and leave a comment and rating on whichever streaming platform you use. To support the podcast, you can click the link in this podcast's description that says support the show. To read other insightful interviews and articles, please check out gagea.georgetown.edu.